The night was colder than usual in Atlanta, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of damp pavement and distant car exhaust. Lieutenant Daniel Carter pulled his patrol car to the curb, rubbing his gloved hands together in a futile attempt to generate warmth. It was nearly the end of his shift, but the quiet hum of the radio in the car reminded him that trouble could arise at any moment. The city never truly slept. As he reached for his coffee, lukewarm and bitter after sitting in the cupholder for hours, his eyes caught movement on the sidewalk across the street. An old man, hunched over and struggling with something, was illuminated in the glow of a flickering street lamp. His hands, rough and gnarled with age, gripped the handles of a battered bicycle with a broken chain. The man attempted to fix it, his fingers fumbling in the dim light, but his frail body betrayed him. Daniel hesitated. He had been on the force long enough to know that stopping to help a stranger could go one of two ways. Either it was an innocent act of kindness, or it could turn into a long, complicated situation that would eat up the rest of his night. But something about the old man's posture, the sheer exhaustion in his stance, tugged at Daniel's instincts. He sighed, pushed open the door, and stepped out of his car. The cold air hit him immediately. Adjusting his belt, he crossed the street, his boots echoing against the pavement. "Sir, do you need some help?" Daniel asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The old man looked up, startled at first, his deep brown eyes, framed by wrinkles and time-worn skin, studied Daniel cautiously. He was African American, likely in his 70s, wearing a tattered coat that had seen better days. "Don't need no handout," the man grumbled, but there was no true hostility in his voice, more like a reflex, one learned after years of pride and hardship. Daniel crouched beside the bike, inspecting the problem. "It's not a handout, just seems like you're having a rough night." The old man exhaled heavily. "Chain snapped, been trying to fix it, but these old hands ain't what they used to be." Daniel pulled out a flashlight from his belt and directed it at the chain. "Let me take a look." The man hesitated but eventually stepped aside. As Daniel worked, silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional sound of passing cars. "You a cop?" the man finally asked. Daniel glanced up, noticing the way the old man's gaze lingered on his badge. "Yeah," Daniel replied simply. The man huffed a small, dry laugh. "A white cop helping out an old black man in the middle of the night. That's new." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He focused on fixing the chain, the rhythmic motion of his fingers grounding him. "Shouldn't be," he finally said. The old man watched him, the corners of his lips twitching into something resembling a smile. "Guess not." After a few minutes, Daniel managed to loop the chain back into place. He tested the pedals, satisfied with his work, then stood and dusted off his hands. "That should hold for now," he said, "but you'll need a replacement soon." The man nodded. "Appreciate it, Officer Carter," Daniel said. "Lieutenant Carter." The man gave him a long look, as if committing his name to memory. Then, after a pause, he extended a calloused hand. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Johnson." Daniel shook his hand, feeling the strength still left in those old fingers. "Nice to meet you, Samuel." The city hummed around them, but for that brief moment, everything else seemed to fade. Neither man realized that this simple act of kindness would be the beginning of something much bigger, something that would shake both of their worlds to the core. Samuel's home was a modest one, an aging two-story house in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Peeling paint, cracked pavement, and the faint sound of distant sirens painted a picture of a place left behind by time. Daniel followed the old man up the creaking steps of the porch, the motion sensor light flickering on as they reached the door. "You sure you want to come in?" Samuel asked, glancing at him over his shoulder. "Cops don't usually stop by places like this unless there's trouble." Daniel shrugged. "Just making sure you get home safe." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head as he unlocked the door. "Suit yourself." The interior was a stark contrast to the exterior. Though worn, the house was clean, meticulously kept. The scent of old books and faint traces of coffee lingered in the air. Shelves lined the walls, filled with hardcovers whose spines bore names Daniel vaguely recognized. "You read a lot?" Daniel asked, scanning the room. Samuel moved slowly, removing his coat and draping it over a wooden chair. "Used to. Eyes ain't as sharp as they once were." Daniel's gaze fell on a small, dust-covered display case near the far wall. Inside were several medals, some military, others he didn't immediately recognize. But what caught his attention was an old black-and-white photograph, faded and creased at the edges. It showed a group of black men in suits, standing together in a march. Samuel noticed where Daniel was looking and let out a quiet sigh. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. Daniel stepped closer. Is that a picture from the civil rights movement?" Samuel nodded. 1965, Montgomery March. "I was there." Daniel turned to face him fully. "You were part of the movement?" Samuel exhaled, settling into a worn armchair. "Not just part of it. I fought for it." Daniel studied him in a new light. He had been trained to read people, to pick up on details most overlooked. And now, looking at Samuel, he saw something more than just an old man living alone in a rundown neighborhood. He saw history. "You fought for it, but..." Daniel hesitated. "What happened?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "The fight don't always end the way you want it to, son." Something in his tone made Daniel realize that whatever had happened to Samuel wasn't just a story. It was a wound that had never quite healed. The room felt heavier, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. And for the first time in his career, Daniel had the unsettling feeling that he was about to learn something that would change everything he thought he knew. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy, as Daniel sat down across from Samuel. The dim light from an old lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. The air in the house seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken truths. Daniel had seen a lot in his years as a police officer: crime, corruption, and the quiet despair of those who had lost faith in the system. But something about Samuel's presence made him feel like he was sitting in the middle of a history lesson that had never made it into the textbooks. Samuel ran a hand over his tired face, his fingers lingering over the deep lines that time had carved into his skin. "You ever hear about the Greenfield Massacre?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel frowned. The name was familiar, but only vaguely. He had heard snippets of it in passing. An old case from decades ago. Something that had been buried under layers of bureaucratic dust. "A little," he admitted. "It was some kind of protest that turned violent." "Right?" Samuel scoffed. A dry, humorless sound. "That's what they tell you in those history books of yours. But that ain't the real story." Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. "Then tell me the real story." Samuel hesitated. He had held onto this truth for so long, buried it deep where no one could reach it. But something about the young officer sitting before him made him believe, just for a moment, that maybe the past wasn't meant to stay hidden. It was 1968. Samuel began, his voice steady despite the emotions brimming beneath the surface. Greenfield was a small town back then, mostly black folks trying to make a living in a world that didn't want us to. But we had dreams. Boy, we had hope. Daniel nodded, listening intently. "There was a man named Elijah Brooks." Samuel continued. "Strong, sharp-minded, had a way with words that could move mountains. He led us, marched with us, spoke for us when no one else would. We were demanding better wages, fair treatment, and the right to vote without fear." Samuel's hands clenched into fists as his voice grew tight. "Then one night, they came, the so-called law, white men in uniform, facking off against us like we were the enemy. We weren't armed, didn't fight back, but they didn't care. They opened fire anyway." Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen enough police reports to know how these stories usually ended. "Elijah was the first to go down," Samuel said, his eyes distant, lost in memories too painful to forget. "Then others, men, Women, even a boy. Just 12 years old. When the smoke cleared, 14 of us were dead. And the ones responsible? Daniel already knew the answer. They walked free. Samuel spat bitterly. Said we started it. Said it was self-defense. Daniel shifted in his seat. Uncomfortable. He wanted to say something. Anything. To acknowledge the horror of what he had just heard. But what words could possibly be enough? Samuel exhaled deeply, shaking his head. After that, I tried to fight. Tried to bring the truth to light. But you know what happens when a black man pushes too hard for justice in this country? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. They framed me, Samuel said. Pinned a murder on me. Said I killed a white businessman during the riot. Gave me 20 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You were innocent? Samuel's laugh was hollow. You even gotta ask? Daniel felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer just an old man's tragic story. This was corruption, injustice, and a past that was still bleeding into the present. Samuel studied him, his sharp eyes locking onto Daniel's. Now you tell me, Lieutenant Carter, he said slowly, you still think the law is always just? Daniel didn't answer, because for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure anymore. Daniel left Samuel's house that night with a storm raging inside him. The cold air should have cleared his mind, but instead, it only seemed to sharpen his thoughts, slicing through him like a blade. He had always believed in the law, in the idea that justice, while not always perfect, was something worth fighting for. But Samuel's story was like a crack in a foundation he had never thought to question. As he drove through the city streets, he found himself replaying the words in his head. The Greenfield Massacre, the framing of an innocent man, the broken promises of justice. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, something in his gut told him Samuel was telling the truth. By the time Daniel arrived at the precinct, his mind was already made up. He needed to find out more. The station was quieter than usual. The night shift officers going about their business with a lazy efficiency. Daniel walked straight to the archives, nodding at the desk sergeant as he passed. Lieutenant, the sergeant greeted him. Didn't expect to see you back tonight. Couldn't sleep, Daniel muttered. Just need to check some old files. The sergeant shrugged and went back to his paperwork. Inside the records room, Daniel scanned through stacks of case files, searching for anything related to the Greenfield Massacre. After almost an hour, he found it, an old, yellowed folder buried under decades of dust. He flipped it open, eyes scanning the reports, the official statements, but something was off. The story Samuel had told him, the real story, was nowhere to be found in these pages. Instead, the reports claimed that the protesters had attacked first, that the police had no choice but to fire in self-defense. The names of the officers involved were conveniently omitted. There was no mention of Samuel Johnson's wrongful conviction, no reference to Elijah Brooks or the 14 lives lost that night. It was a lie, all of it. Daniel clenched his fists. He had read his fair share of reports like this before. Stories rewritten by those in power to protect themselves. His stomach churned with something unfamiliar. Anger. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. You looking for something specific, Carter? Daniel turned sharply. It was Captain Richard Monroe, his superior, standing in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that put Daniel on edge. Just checking some old records, Daniel replied carefully. Monroe stepped into the room, his gaze drifting toward the open folder on the table. He let out a slow breath. That's a dangerous rabbit hole you're going down, son, Monroe said quietly. Some things are best left in the past. Daniel's jaw tightened. And if the past was a lie? Monroe studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. Be careful, Carter, he warned. You start digging too deep, and you might not like what you find. Daniel watched as Monroe walked away, his words lingering in the air like a warning. But it was too late. The foundation had already cracked. and Daniel Carter was about to uncover something that would change everything. Daniel drove home that night with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced through everything he had read, everything Samuel had told him. The Greenfield massacre, the wrongful conviction, the police cover-up. It was a tangled mess of lies and corruption, hidden beneath decades of silence. And now he had stepped right into it. The words of Captain Monroe echoed in his head. Some things are best left in the past. That wasn't a warning, it was a threat. Monroe had known exactly what Daniel was looking for, which meant he had been watched. The realization sent a chill down his spine. When he pulled into the driveway of his small house, the street was unusually quiet. He scanned the area before stepping out, his instincts sharp. The air was still, but something felt wrong. He had learned to trust that feeling over the years. Slowly, he approached his front door and inserted his key. But before he could turn the knob, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A black SUV parked across the street. It was too dark to see inside, but the way it was positioned, engine running, lights off, it wasn't just some neighbor's car. Someone was watching him. Daniel hesitated, considering his options. He could confront them. He could call it in. But something told him that whoever was inside wouldn't stick around for a conversation. Instead, he acted as if he hadn't noticed, pushing open his door and stepping inside. He locked it behind him and immediately went to the window. Peeking through the blinds, the SUV remained there for a few moments longer before slowly pulling away. Disappearing into the night, he let out a breath. But the tension in his muscles didn't fade. Someone didn't like that he was digging. And if they were watching him this early, it meant things were only going to get worse. The next morning, Daniel walked into the precinct with a sense of unease. His usual routine, grabbing a cup of stale coffee, nodding at the other officers, felt different now. He was no longer just another cop doing his job. He was a man with a target on his back. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, he went straight to the records department. The same sergeant from the night before gave him a wary look as he walked in. Back again, Lieutenant? Daniel forced a casual shrug. Just following up on something. The sergeant didn't question him, but there was something in his expression that made Daniel uneasy. He ignored it and went back to the old case files, flipping through them quickly. He wanted to make copies of everything he had found last night, just in case. But as he reached for the Greenfield Massacre folder, his heart dropped. It was gone. He rifled through the other files, checking every drawer, but it had vanished without a trace. Someone had taken it. Someone knew exactly what he was looking for. Looking for something specific? A voice asked from behind him. Daniel turned sharply, already knowing who it was before he saw the smirk. Detective Sean Landry leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He was one of Monroe's men, the kind of cop who had been on the force long enough to know how to play the game. His reputation was one of quiet intimidation. He never needed to raise his voice to make a point. Daniel kept his expression neutral, just checking some old cases. Landry's smirk didn't fade. Funny thing, though, some of those old cases have a way of disappearing when people go looking in the wrong places. Daniel held his gaze. Is that right? Landry stepped closer, lowering his voice. Let me give you a little advice. Carter, you got a good career ahead of you. No need to throw it away over something that doesn't concern you. Daniel clenched his jaw. An innocent man went to prison for 20 years. That concerns me. Landry sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? You think this is about one man? This goes deeper than you realize. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Then why are you so scared of me finding out the truth? For the first time, Landry's smirk faded. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the records room, fists clenched. They had made their message clear, but they had underestimated him. That evening, Daniel found himself back at Samuel's house. The old man opened the door slowly, his eyes flicking to the street before stepping aside to let Daniel in. You were followed, Samuel said simply. Daniel froze. How do you know? Samuel sighed, walking over to his window and pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside. Because I know how they work. I've been watching my back for 50 years. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. They took the file, he admitted. Samuel didn't look surprised. Of course they did. I don't get it, Daniel muttered. This case is old. Why go through all this trouble to keep it buried? Samuel turned to face him. Because it ain't over. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Samuel's gaze was steady. You ever ask yourself why they framed me in the first place? Daniel hesitated. Because they needed a scapegoat. Samuel shook his head. That was part of it. But the real reason? I knew too much. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. About what? Samuel leaned in. That massacre? It wasn't just some random act of violence. It was planned. The police, the city officials, even some folks in the government, they wanted to send a message. And they made damn sure anyone who tried to expose it got taken out. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You mean, Elijah Brooks wasn't just a leader? Samuel interrupted. He had proof, documents, names, bank records, all of it. He was gonna go public. And that's why they killed him. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. If what Samuel was saying was true, then this wasn't just an old case. It was a conspiracy that had been covered up for decades. And now, by digging into it, Daniel had put himself directly in the crosshairs. The next day, Daniel found himself being called into Captain Monroe's office. The air in the precinct was tense, officers avoiding his gaze as he walked through the hallways. He could feel it now, the weight of something pressing down on him. When he stepped inside, Monroe was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Have a seat, Monroe said. Daniel didn't. If this is about the case I've been looking into. Monroe cut him off. It's about your future, Carter. Daniel stiffened. Monroe leaned forward. You're a good cop, smart, you've got potential, but right now, you're standing at a crossroads. You keep pushing, and you'll find yourself on the wrong side of this department real quick. Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. Is that a threat, Captain? Monroe's eyes darkened. It's a fact. Daniel exhaled slowly. Samuel Johnson was innocent. He was framed to protect people like you. And you expect me to just walk away? Monroe sighed, shaking his head. You still think this is about justice? You're in over your head, Carter. And if you don't back off, you won't like where this road leads. Daniel clenched his fists. He had a choice to make. But deep down, he already knew what he had to do. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Daniel left Captain Monroe's office with his blood boiling. Every step he took through the precinct felt heavier, like he was dragging the weight of something much bigger than himself. He had spent his entire career believing in the system, trusting that justice, while flawed, was still something that could be reached if you fought hard enough. But now, that belief was crumbling. By the time he got to his car, his mind was already racing through options. He had lost the official records, but Samuel's story was still alive, still burning in his mind. If he could find out what happened to the original evidence, the documents Elijah Brooks had gathered, then maybe he could finally expose the truth. But first, he had to find out who was pulling the strings. He pulled out his phone and dialed Lisa, his younger sister and one of the best civil rights attorneys in the city. It rang twice before she picked up. Danny? She said, her voice slightly muffled. I thought you were on shift. I need to see you, he said, cutting straight to the point. It's about a case, a big one. There was a pause. Lisa had always been sharp, always able to tell when something wasn't right. Come by my office, she said. Now, Daniel started his car, but just as he reached the first intersection, his rearview mirror caught something. A black SUV. The same one from the night before. His stomach twisted. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were waiting for him to make the wrong move. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Let them follow. They had no idea he was about to lead them straight into the fire. Lisa Carter had built her career on exposing corruption, while Daniel had chosen to fight crime from within the system. She had dedicated herself to tearing down the parts of it that were rotten. When he walked into her office, she already had her arms crossed, eyes scanning him with concern. "You look like hell," she said. "Feels like it," he muttered. She motioned for him to sit, but he didn't. Instead, he closed the blinds to her window before turning to face her. "This has to stay between us," he said. "I don't even know how deep this goes yet." Lisa's brows furrowed. "What the hell did you get yourself into?" Daniel took a deep breath. Then he told her everything. About Samuel, about Greenfield, about the missing files, about the men watching him. When he finished, Lisa sat back in her chair, running a hand through her tight curls. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, "if what you're saying is true." "It is," Daniel interrupted. Lisa exhaled sharply. "Okay, first things first, you need protection. If someone went through the trouble of erasing those files, they're not going to stop at just watching you." Daniel nodded, already knowing that was true. "And I need to find out where Elijah Brooks's evidence went. If we can get our hands on that, we can blow this whole thing wide open." Lisa tapped her fingers against the desk. "I know someone who might help." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Lisa smirked. "You're not the only one with contacts in law enforcement, Danny. There's a retired detective, Jared Thompson. He used to be internal affairs. Spent years investigating corruption in the department before he retired early, under suspicious circumstances." Daniel frowned. "You trust him?" Lisa shrugged. "I trust that he hates dirty cops more than anything. If anyone knows where the bodies are buried, it's him." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Set it up." Lisa picked up her phone, and Daniel looked out the window. The SUV was still there. Whoever was watching him was about to realize he wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. The meeting with Jared Thompson took place in a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the coffee was terrible, but the conversations were private. Jared was in his 60s, his gray beard trimmed short, his eyes sharp despite the tired lines on his face. He watched Daniel carefully as Lisa made the introductions. "So," Jared said, stirring his coffee, "you're the one dumb enough to dig up Greenfield." Daniel smirked. "Guess that makes two of us." Jared chuckled. "Fair point." He leaned forward. "I read the original files back in the day. Before they were wiped. It was a massacre. Plain and simple. And Elijah Brooks? That man was sitting on a goldmine of evidence. He had bank statements linking the city's police chief to secret payments. Witness testimonies from officers who wanted out. It would have brought the whole damn department down." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What happened to it?" Jared's face darkened. "Brooks's house was raided the night before he was killed. The police claimed they found nothing. But I know for a fact that's bullshit." Daniel leaned in. "So where did it go?" Jared hesitated. Then he said, "There was a young officer back then. Rookie. The only one who didn't buy into the cover-up. He took something from Brooks's place before the higher-ups could get their hands on it." Daniel's breath caught. "Who?" Jared's gaze was steady. "A man named Samuel Johnson." Daniel felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Samuel had the evidence, and he had never told him. Daniel drove straight to Samuel's house, his mind racing. He had trusted the old man, believed his story. But now, he realized there was something Samuel had left out. Something crucial. When he knocked on the door, it took longer than usual for Samuel to answer. The old man's eyes were tired, but they sharpened as soon as he saw Daniel's face. "You found out," Samuel said quietly. Daniel stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You have the evidence," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "The records, the documents. You've had them this whole time." Samuel sighed, closing the door behind him. "I never lied to you, son. But you didn't tell me the truth either." Daniel shot back. Samuel sat down, rubbing his hands together. You think I didn't want to expose them? You think I didn't want to burn the whole damn system down for what they did?" He shook his head. "I tried, Carter, but every time I got close, people started dying. Elijah was first, then anyone who helped me." Daniel clenched his fists. "So you ran." "I survived," Samuel corrected, "and I kept that evidence hidden. Because if I didn't, it would have been buried just like Elijah." Daniel took a deep breath. "Where is it now?" Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up, and the weight of decades of pain was in his eyes. "It's in a place only I know," he said, "and if you're serious about this, I'll take you there." Daniel nodded. Because now, there was no turning back, and the truth was finally within reach. The early morning air was crisp as Daniel pulled his car into the long-abandoned industrial district on the outskirts of Atlanta. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Samuel sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee, a quiet rhythm of nerves or anticipation. Daniel wasn't sure which. They hadn't spoken much on the drive over, after Samuel had revealed that he had hidden the evidence decades ago. Daniel had known there was no turning back. If they were right, if this was truly the missing link to exposing the Greenfield cover-up, then it was the kind of truth that could burn down careers, institutions, and maybe even lives. Samuel finally spoke, his voice calm but distant. "We're close." Daniel followed his directions, turning down a narrow alley between two rusting warehouse buildings. At the end of the alley stood an old, run-down storage facility, the kind that had once been used for freight shipments but had long since been abandoned. Samuel pointed at the third unit from the left. "That's the one." Daniel parked the car, stepping out cautiously. His eyes scanned the area, instincts kicking in. The place was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of birds, no distant hum of city life, just stillness. It put him on edge. Samuel moved slower, his age making every step a little more deliberate. He pulled a small, rusted key from his pocket, walking up to the old metal door. With a bit of effort, he jammed the key into the lock and turned. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing darkness inside. A faint smell of dust and oil filled Daniel's nose. He pulled out his flashlight and stepped inside first, sweeping the beam across the room. Rows of old wooden crates and rusting metal shelves lined the storage unit. But Samuel ignored them all. Walking straight to the back wall, he reached for a loose panel near the floor, kneeling down with a quiet grunt of effort. With shaking fingers, he pried the panel open and reached inside. For a moment, Daniel held his breath. Then Samuel pulled out an old, leather-bound journal. It was thick, its pages yellowed with time. He dusted it off carefully before handing it to Daniel. "This is it," Samuel said. Daniel took the book, flipping it open. Inside were pages upon pages of handwritten notes, receipts, meeting transcripts, every detail Elijah Brooks had collected before he was murdered. It was the smoking gun. But before he could react, something outside caught his attention, a faint shuffle of footsteps, and then, the sound of a gun being cocked. Samuel's eyes widened. "They found us." Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him down behind one of the metal shelves just as gunfire erupted. The sharp cracks echoed through the storage unit, sending sparks flying as bullets ricocheted off the metal. Samuel gritted his teeth, holding onto the shelf for support. "I told you they wouldn't stop," he muttered. Daniel peeked around the corner, his heart hammering. 3 men dressed in dark clothing had entered through the storage unit's main door. Their weapons raised. Professionals. No badges. No uniforms. Not cops. Hired killers. Daniel's mind worked fast. They had to get out, fast. He reached for his gun, steadying his breath. He wasn't a fool. He knew he was outnumbered. And Samuel wasn't in any condition to run or fight. Samuel clutched the journal tightly, his knuckles white. "This thing is worth killing for," he said, "and they ain't gonna stop till we're dead." Daniel made a decision. He pulled his phone from his pocket and sent a quick text to Lisa with their location. Then he whispered to Samuel, "Stay low, follow my lead." More gunfire rang out, and Daniel fired back, aiming for cover rather than kills. The goal wasn't to win a firefight. It was to escape. A bullet slammed into the crate next to Samuel, sending wood splinters flying. He let out a sharp breath. "I ain't been shot at in a long time," he muttered. "Let's keep it that way," Daniel growled. He spotted a side door, an old emergency exit. "Their only way out. Run on my mark," Daniel whispered. Samuel nodded. Daniel took a deep breath, then fired 3 quick shots toward the attackers, forcing them to duck. "Go!" Samuel moved as fast as his body allowed, limping toward the exit. Daniel covered him, firing blindly to keep the killers at bay. The moment Samuel hit the door, Daniel was right behind him. He slammed his shoulder against it, breaking the rusted latch, and they stumbled outside into the blinding morning light. A car screeched to a stop in front of them. "Lisa, get in," she shouted. Samuel climbed in first, and Daniel jumped in after him, slamming the door shut as Lisa floored the gas. Bullets tore through the air behind them, but they were gone before the assassins could reach them. Daniel let out a long breath. They had barely made it. But now, there was no doubt, whoever had tried to kill them wasn't just trying to keep secrets buried. They were trying to erase history itself. Lisa drove fast, weaving through the city streets until they were miles away from the industrial district. No one spoke for several minutes, the tension still thick in the air. Daniel finally broke the silence. "They knew exactly where we were. That means they're watching us, listening to us." Lisa kept her eyes on the road. "Then we need to assume nowhere is safe." Samuel held the journal against his chest, his breath still unsteady. "We have to make this count," he said. "If we don't release this to the right people, it's gonna disappear just like last time." Daniel nodded. He pulled out his phone and made a decision. "I know someone," he said, "an investigative journalist. If we give this to her, she can make sure the whole world sees it before they can cover it up again." Lisa glanced at him in the mirror. "You trust her?" Daniel hesitated. Trust was a luxury he didn't have anymore. But he had no choice. "Yeah," he said, "I do." They met Emily Vasquez, an award-winning journalist, in a dimly lit parking garage downtown. She had made a name for herself uncovering government scandals, and she was one of the few people Daniel knew wouldn't back down, no matter how powerful her enemies were. She took the journal from Samuel, flipping through the pages with wide eyes. "Jesus," she whispered. This is huge." Daniel nodded. "We need to go public. Fast." Emily exhaled sharply. "This isn't just gonna take down dirty cops. It's gonna take down city officials, politicians, people with real power." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's the point." Emily looked up at them. "You know what happens next, right? The moment this gets out, they're gonna come for all of you." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had already made his decision. "Let them come." Emily nodded. "I'll start making calls. But once this is out there, there's no taking it back." Daniel exchanged a glance with Lisa and Samuel. This was it. The truth was finally coming to light. And the war was just beginning. Emily Vasquez left the parking garage with the journal clutched tightly in her hands, her expression a mixture of determination and anxiety. Daniel watched her disappear into the night, knowing full well what he had just set into motion. There was no undoing this. Lisa leaned against the car, arms crossed. "We need to prepare for fallout," she said. "Once that story breaks, we won't have the luxury of moving in the shadows anymore." Samuel sat in the backseat, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "They're gonna come harder than ever." His voice was low, almost resigned. "They don't care about bad press. They care about control." Daniel nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Which means we need to assume they'll come after us before the story goes public." Lisa's phone buzzed. She checked it, then cursed under her breath. "Shit." She turned the screen toward them. It was a breaking news alert. Police Lieutenant Daniel Carter wanted for questioning in connection to unauthorized access of police records. Daniel's stomach twisted. They're trying to flip this on me. Samuel shook his head. That's just the start. Lisa scrolled down, reading aloud. Sources within the department claim Carter illegally obtained confidential files and may be linked to classified information leaks. She looked up at Daniel. They're making you the fall guy. Daniel exhaled sharply. I should have seen this coming. Samuel gave a bitter chuckle. That's what they do, son. They make the truth sound like a crime. Lisa's phone rang. She answered quickly, turning away to speak in hushed tones. After a few moments, she turned back to them, her face pale. That was Jared, she said, referring to the retired internal affairs detective. He just got word from his sources. An arrest warrant for you is being processed right now. Daniel clenched his fists. That fast? Lisa nodded grimly. They want you in custody before the truth gets out. Samuel met Daniel's gaze. So what's the move? Daniel took a deep breath. We don't stop. We don't run. We fight. Lisa frowned. You mean, we go public first? Daniel interrupted. We don't wait for Emily's article to hit. We need to get ahead of this. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. We need to get you on camera. We can live stream it. Samuel rubbed his jaw. If we do this, we need to be somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't shut it down before we finish. Daniel thought for a moment, then turned to Lisa. Your office? She shook her head. They'll track us there. Samuel exhaled. I know a place. Daniel and Lisa both turned to him. Where? Lisa asked. Samuel's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Church. The small, historic church sat in the heart of the community. Its old wooden structure weathered but strong. Samuel had chosen it for a reason. It was one of the few places in the city that still belonged to the people, not the system. Daniel sat on the front pew, his mind racing. Lisa set up the camera and microphone on a tripod, testing the connection. The church doors were locked, but the uneasy silence in the air told them they were running on borrowed time. Samuel stood near the altar, looking up at the stained glass windows. It's funny, he said. I used to come here when I was younger. We held meetings here, marched from here. He exhaled. Feels like coming full circle. Lisa checked the feed. All right, we're live in 3, 2. Daniel faced the camera, his heart pounding. My name is Lieutenant Daniel Carter. He began, and I am a police officer. Or at least, I was. He took a deep breath. The people I work for, the people who are supposed to protect you, have been lying for decades. They've been covering up a crime that took place over 50 years ago. And now, because I tried to expose it, they are trying to silence me. Lisa glanced at the screen. Comments were already flooding in. The video was spreading fast. Daniel continued. Samuel Johnson, the man sitting beside me, was framed for a crime he didn't commit. A man named Elijah Brooks was murdered because he had the evidence that could have taken down some of the most corrupt officials this city has ever seen. He looked directly into the camera. And now, we have that evidence, and we are making sure the world sees it. Samuel held up the journal, flipping through the pages. This book contains names, bank records, signed confessions, everything they tried to bury. Lisa's phone buzzed. She checked it, then turned to them, her face grim. We have to move. Now. Daniel barely had time to react before the church doors were kicked open. Officers flooded into the church, weapons drawn. Daniel moved instinctively, putting himself between Samuel and the advancing cops. Captain Monroe stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Carter, he said, voice calm, put your hands where I can see them. Lisa still had the live stream going. Daniel prayed people were watching. This is a mistake, Daniel said, keeping his hands visible but making no move to surrender. You know exactly what's happening here. Monroe's jaw tightened. You illegally obtained department files and leaked them. Samuel scoffed. Boy, you know damn well that's a lie. Daniel exhaled. Monroe, Don't do this. You can still make the right choice. Monroe didn't answer, but something flickered in his eyes, hesitation. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a voice rang out from behind Monroe. Captain, we've got a problem. A young officer rushed in. Holding a phone, he handed it to Monroe, who looked down at the screen. His face darkened as he scrolled. Daniel knew what he was seeing. The video, the evidence. It was too late to stop it. Monroe exhaled sharply. He turned to Daniel, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. You win. Daniel's breath caught. Monroe lowered his gun. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. But one by one, they followed suit. Lisa let out a shaky breath. Holy shit, she whispered. Samuel gave a low, tired chuckle. Took him long enough. Monroe looked at Daniel, his face hard. I hope you know what you just started. Daniel met his gaze. Yeah, he said. I do. The fallout was immediate. The video had gone viral. News stations picked up the story. And within 24 hours, officials were scrambling to control the damage. Arrests were made. Investigations were launched. And for the first time in decades, the truth was finally out. Daniel knew his career was over. But he didn't care. Samuel, for the first time in his life, walked free. Not just as an exonerated man, but as a symbol of resilience. The city had tried to break him. It had tried to bury him. But he had survived. And now, thanks to Daniel, he had justice. As they stood outside the courthouse, reporters surrounding them, Samuel turned to Daniel. You didn't have to help me that night, he said. But you did. Daniel smiled. I guess one good act can change everything. Samuel chuckled. That it can, son. That it can. And together, they walked forward into a future where the truth could no longer be silenced.